Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today is July 10th, and the topic today is Trump and Putin, or to be specifically, why is Trump changed his opinion on Putin? Or why is there a flip-flop and a new position on the Ukraine war? This is the topic. Now, it seems to be there is a certain inconsistency in what President Trump is saying. For the first time, he said, there's a BS coming from Putin. For the first time, he's saying that he's changing his position on the Ukraine war. Up to now, he's been saying that's not my war, this is Biden's war. He kept repeating how horrible it is that there's so many lives lost. And it needs to be stopped. Now, for the first time, he's saying, no. Ukraine must defend itself. Now, we have heard that for 3 years. Ukraine must defend itself from Russian aggression. So Trump is now saying the same thing as Biden was saying. So does that mean that American position is becoming that of President Biden and of the neocons and of the Democrats? Let's figure out what's going on and what the reasons for this abrupt change in U.S. policy is. Now, I think that the key to it is to try to follow, is there any pattern in what Trump has been saying over the last 2 or 3 months? And it seems to me that there is. And the pattern itself is flip-flops. In other words, abrupt changes of American position. And then, of course, one has to explain why this is happening. For a long time, I believed in many of my previous videos that Trump was on the way of making a deal with President Putin. It seemed like they had established some kind of a rapport and the relationship, and it seemed like it was something that is indeed taking place. But as it seems to be now, there's the Trump comes to in a different mood, and one has to explain why. And this rapprochement is coming to an end with, I think, potentially very, very dangerous consequences. So, what about the changing of position, the flip-flops? Now, the most important one is the recent one, non-delivery of weapons, publicly announced a week ago, no more weapons to Ukraine. Then now he obviously looks almost like Biden, posing the question, who made the decision? I don't know whether this was Hesed, whether it was somebody else, but now it seems like nobody knows what the decision was. Nobody knows how many Patriot missiles would be delivered, when they would be delivered, on what money, and is just totally unprepared to answer any substantive question. Why? Now, the second interesting inconsistency was over the Iran-Israel war. As we all know, it was full of inconsistencies. On the one hand, we're negotiating and we're close, and now Iran deal is going to happen. Then all of a sudden, there's Israeli bombardment, then U.S. bombardment. Then we may resume negotiations, we may not resume negotiations. And no consistency whatsoever to the present day. It's just all suspended. Any day there could be a resumption of hostilities, and any day there could be an announcement that some kind of agreement is going to be very, very soon. Inconsistency after inconsistency. I think there's the same answer to both of those inconsistencies, and that is weapons. The Israeli attack on Iran was based on the assumption that they would defeat very quickly, and as they had announced themselves, totally dominate the skies over Iran. That didn't happen. In fact, there was a total surprise to the Israelis that the Iranian missiles hit the targets that the Israelis never thought they were able to. And that they were running out of missiles, just as the Ukrainians were running out of missiles. And that Trump had to admit that the only way, and I remember I praised him for that, the only way forward is to stop hostilities immediately to avoid defeat by Israel. As we discussed before, Israel is much smaller, Iran is a huge country. It has prepared very well for this assault. And despite the initial casualties and the murder of its scientists and commanders and so forth, Iran recovered very quickly and made a very, very serious damage to Israel, its reputation and its economy and its self-confidence. Now, so as a result, Trump had to withdraw, had to retreat. That's the point. President Trump pulled the plug, had to retreat and declare victory. He declared victory. There's no more nuclear program. It's all been obliterated. There's no more to fight, no cause. In other words, that's the pattern. The pattern is to declare victory and withdraw. Now, it seems that that was the way things were going in Ukraine as well. But today, or yesterday, he announced that there'll be a resumption of deliveries. Now, as I discussed in my previous video, that is not going to change the situation on the ground. Even if they deliver a new battery of Patriots, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, it is not going to make any difference, because the Russians have been showing now that they are bombarding military targets in Ukraine with a combination of Shahed missiles, drones and missiles, subsonic and hypersonic, every single day. It was 500, the next day it was 750. Very soon that they will reach of 1,000 drones and missiles a day. Now, I've heard some military analysis who say that the United States produces 600 Patriot missiles a year. Now, in order to defend the skies of Ukraine, they would need to spend hundreds in a few days. In other words, a year's supply, even if all of it went to Ukraine. In other words, that's impossible. But as I discussed in the previous video, even if it were possible, defending Ukrainian sky would not deliver victory to Ukraine. So what we're coming now to a situation which makes things clear for the first time. The reason that Trump is so upset with Putin is because Putin has shown real power over the capacity of the United States to produce missiles. This is a structural problem of US military. It is too expensive. It just cannot be sustained in the current war environment. So the Russians are outproducing not just the United States, but the entire capacity of NATO, at least for the foreseeable future. So this is why he's so upset with Putin. At first, Trump thought that he could negotiate with him and force him to some kind of a compromise, which means he was not ready to accept the Russian memorandum. He was not ready to accept the loss of 4 provinces by Ukraine. He thought that Putin would go along for the sake of good relationship, and it turned out that Putin basically said, my way or no way. That 4 provinces and the other provisions of the Russian memorandum. Now, again, in the context of Russian politics, let's not forget that the 4 provinces is something that that Putin announced a year ago. In June 2024. Right now, very, very few people in Russia would be content with just 4 provinces. Basically, the reasoning is overall shared, not just the generals, but everywhere in the army especially, but also in society, that Russia cannot allow to have a regime in a neighboring country that used to be a part of Russia, but any neighboring country that just can send any day some kind of drones that could hit its military infrastructure, or that could hit a beach in Kursk province with civilian casualties. It just cannot do that. That no country would actually allow anything like that. And there are no guarantees that even if there is a ceasefire, or that even if there is a peace treaty with this kind of regime of the neo-Banderovite ruling class, that this would not happen again. So the more the West is promising, as the European Union done, and to supply Ukraine with billions of dollars or euros of military aid and sustaining that regime, the more they do it, the more they actually strengthen those in Russia who say the only solution is to march on Kiev and put an end to that regime. Now, to put it in different terms, when the negotiations were still going on in Istanbul and others, there were many in Russia who feared that President Putin would succumb to the temptation to strike a deal with President Trump, and that there would be just 4 provinces. Now, everybody was kind of thinking, well, maybe this is not good enough. And now the recent announcement by President Trump that they are going to resume deliveries of weapons to Ukraine is actually met with great appreciation by those in Russia who seek to deal Ukraine a devastating blow and finish the war by total and complete surrender of Ukraine. Now they say that the masks are off, that Trump has shown his real face, and that is of a neocon and an imperialist and a America first, meaning that it should dictate its will to the rest of the world. Now these people are arguing, okay, now we know who Mr. Trump is, and now we know he wants to increase NATO 5% of the GDP. So it's all clear what he's up to, and therefore we have to intensify our campaign and lead the war to its conclusion. But let's get back to Trump. What I also want to make a kind of an interpretation, not only in terms of his policy to Putin, but to put his policy to resume deliveries of Ukraine in the context of his other recent decisions. And it seems to me what they all add up to is that Trump is slowly capitulating or slowly surrendering his positions of a kind of a revolutionary MAGA change in terms of fighting the deep state. But more and more he's making an accommodation with the deep state, with the Democrats, with the political and military establishment. I pointed to that out in my video on the big beautiful bill. This is another illustration of what Trump has been doing over the last 3 months. The first 3 months was a kind of a attack and destroy and vicious attack on the spending, on the deep state, on the establishment, on the courts, and acquiring freedom of action. But the last 3 months was accommodation. In other words, instead of drastically cutting Pentagon budget and closing wasteful bases that need to be maintained all over the world and cost a lot of money, the United States, well, actually President Trump, not only didn't curtail the budget of the Pentagon, but increased it to $1 trillion. Now, just in his first term, remember this, there was 500 billion. Now there's $1 trillion. In other words, under President Trump, not Biden, under President Trump, first and his now second term, he doubled the Pentagon budget, doubled. Without any accounting, nobody actually knows what the money is going for, and a lot of it probably goes to the pockets of Zelensky and his friends. Now, that's an accommodation. Now, if we'll also look at other items, this is why Musk broke with President Trump. Other items show what they call in American political vocabulary pork, which means bribes, which means assignment of certain spending to certain specific states, and Congress districts to make sure that these people are satisfied and that they would vote the appropriate way. And that's been done like that for a very long time. That is the essence of American political life and American political system. You basically reward those who support you with all kinds of little bits and pieces that are worked into an overall budget, so that this is benefit and this benefit and this benefit and that state and that Congress district. That is the way it's been done for decades. And Trump has basically returned to the same pattern, of rewarding those who support him and attacking those that hurt him. And if you look at the way tariffs actually affect the United States, it's not surprising that the hardest hit would be California, which is a state run by the Democrats, and New York. And there are other places that are deliberately targeted to be hurt by these tariffs because these are the Democrats. In other words, what Trump is concerned about is not to reform the United States, but to make sure that he has a chance to win in the congressional elections next year. But here's the problem. His accommodation with the deep state and with the Pentagon and with the military-industrial complex actually leads to a situation where he may lose the next elections, because the MAGA movement are angry Americans who wanted real reforms. And not only in deporting poor Mexicans who work in the fields, and very few of them are hardcore criminals, and he puts it, but normal people who work in the jobs that most Americans don't want, mostly in construction under the burning sun, building houses. In other words, what Trump has been doing is undermining his own base with the failure of his reforms to attack the deep state, his accommodation with the deep state, his desire to make it look like there is a reform and that there is a new beginning, is only nothing but a mirage. And if he does not deliver in the promises he made, he may lose. And if he loses the just 5 or 6 seats in the Congress, he's going to be a lame duck president. And that's why this would be looked upon as a time of wasted opportunities. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon in the next edition of Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin.